Good morning, folks. It just occurred to me as I was turning on my recorder for the day that one of the weird consequences of Corona is that you're going to become intimately familiar with my collection of coffee mugs. So, good morning. Welcome to your lecture for the day. And there is never in the world enough coffee to get through the Corona crisis. I'm surprised they haven't sold out of coffee yet at the grocery stores. Oh God, knock on wood. Oh God, if that happens, we're screwed. Okay, whoa. Don't panic, Catherine. They did not sell out of coffee. Anyway, you're probably tired of me rambling already, 30 seconds into lecture. So let's get started for today. Today and in our next class, we talk about Reconstruction. Now, Reconstruction and redemption kind of go hand in hand as this moment in U.S. history, and I really love talking about it. Total spoiler alert, I taught an entire class on the Civil War and Reconstruction. It was the first class I taught ever that they threw me into, and it was an utter disaster because I just talked like constantly because I didn't know how to teach, and I just rambled. Not that I don't do that now, but it was a lot worse. So I could talk about this forever. I have talked about this forever, and I love talking about Reconstruction because the thing about Reconstruction is that after the Civil War, the entire nation was like, oh fuck, things could really be different. Like, it's not just ending slavery. Like, the whole relationship of the nation is different. And it raised all of these questions. Like, well, are black people citizens now? Do we focus on industry now? Do we occupy the South? Should we execute all of the people that rebelled? How do we avoid this in the future? What do we do to cope with this? It raised all of these fascinating questions. And essentially, you're going to have this big war, right? You're going to have this massive war, and everybody, imagine this. Imagine you came over to my house right now, right? And you were like, I hate cows. And I was like, the fuck's wrong with you? And you were like, I'm sorry, but it's just something that I believe in, and I hate cows. And so we got in a fist fight, right? Eventually, one of us would end up bloodied on the floor, but when things were over, we wouldn't have resolved the cow issue. That would still be there. So the point stands for the nation. It's probably an unnecessary sort of illustration. The point stands for the nation. You can bloody each other up, but that doesn't actually mean that the issues were solved. So at the end of the Civil War, you still have a South that is not industrialized. You still have the problem that the South's economy had been built on slavery. You still have the problem that Northerners saw a different version of progress. You still have the problem that black people are not wrapped into the nation as citizens yet, and they don't have the tools to be citizens. So you have a lot of problems after the war, and that shit doesn't get solved by Lee surrendering at Appomattox. Actually, it just opened up a whole other can of worms as to, okay, what are we going to do, right? So I've been telling you, in short, that the war has ended. These last couple of classes kind of belie that point. Instead of looking at the war ending in 1865, I want you to think about the war transitioning into different kinds of political battles, different kinds of violence, different kinds of activism that happened because formal war was over. And that fighting, that disagreement, just went to different fronts. Right, we don't change the first slide. Okay, things that you're going to consider, and I'm trying to do a better job of making these directly relate to your discussion questions. What would reconciliation require after a war like this? If you don't know what the word reconciliation means, look it up. But basically it means getting back together, right? What would mending together the nation, what people at the time phrased it as binding the nation's wounds. They phrased it as sewing back together the nation, mending the nation. What would that require after a war of this catastrophic scale? When 2% of the population is dead, when the water in Gettysburg is contaminated with blood, when the entire South has been scorched in Sherman's March to the Sea, what the hell do you need and how do you do it? Why do you need those things? What about the war created that post-war world? We're going to talk more about that next time too. this is the big question of today. What was the role of the presidency and the role of Congress? So in all of this shit that needs to get done, what is Congress supposed to do? What is the president supposed to do? How are they both managing their jobs? And obviously, Congress and the president would change over the course of our conversation. I say conversation like y'all can talk back to me. In class, I could legit call it a conversation, but here, you're screwed. You just gotta listen. And what was radical about radical Reconstruction? When I say radical, again, that's a good word to look up. I mean like totally revolutionary. Actually, that's a better way to phrase this question. What was revolutionary about radical Reconstruction? You're all going to think that I'm crazy if I remember and actually go back and change that, and then you'll be like, it never said radical, you're an idiot. And I'll be like, it did, but you didn't see that process. And anyway, none of this is important. Okay, so basically, I need you to understand the role of the federal government, the shit that they had to do, and how different visions of the shit that they had to do mattered. Okay, so envision that you are Abraham Lincoln, okay? Congratulations, you're very, 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 very famous, and you also have a pretty amazing hat. So imagine that you were Abraham Lincoln. You've just lived through this war. You were like kind of a nobody politician prior to 1860, but then you got all pissed in Illinois and everyone was like, you should run for president, and so you did, and then you got elected, and all of a sudden the South was like, screw you guys, I'm going home. That's a South Park reference. And they seceded from the Union, and then you fought this massive war, and you're like, okay, finally, May of 1865, Confederates have surrendered. Like, the first thing that happens is that the Union soldiers share their rations with Confederate soldiers that hadn't eaten in like freaking forever because the Confederacy was in real dire straits by that point. What do you need to do? What's on your plate? Like if you're Lincoln and you're writing the to-do list, it's a big to-do list. And what is on that to-do list? This is the part where I would ask you to think about those things. It's hard to downplay that. I mean, it's hard to overstate what Lincoln had to do. As the president, his job would be to create a cohesive political world between the North and the South. But there were a lot of obstacles to doing so. That like minor issue of slavery, yeah, you still have to resolve that. The Emancipation Proclamation had been passed in 1863, but it didn't actually free all slaves in all areas. You'd have to figure out the vote for black people. You'd have to figure out the vote for white people that fought in the war. You'd have to figure out what to do about an economically devastated South. You'd have to figure out what to do about a rapidly expanded bureaucracy in the federal government. You'd have to figure out how the hell to help black people adjust to the world after slavery was over. You would have to figure out what to do with all of those Confederates that rebelled. You would have to figure out how to demobilize the army. You would have to figure out how to neutralize the Confederate army. You would have to figure out what to do with Southern sympathizers that didn't follow an army but were renegades in the South. So if you were Lincoln, your to-do list is massive. He barely had time to start processing this. And it's not like the war ended and he was like, oh shit, I have things to do. He was processing this in the months before the war ended. But he wasn't able to get all that much done before the war ended. And he didn't have that much time. 5 days after the surrender, he was assassinated. The assassination happened by a man named John Wilkes Booth, and it happened in Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. This is Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Martha, and they had gone with another couple who was a high-ranking general or a high-ranking officer in the Army to watch a play called Our American Cousin. The play was a comedy, and at one point in the acting, there was a joke, and people laughed, and John Wilkes Booth used the laughter from that moment to cover up a gunshot to Abraham Lincoln's head, which people did not notice at first. Of course, it's pretty hard to avoid, so they noticed it pretty soon. Abraham Lincoln was laughing when the bullet entered his head. John Wilkes Booth was like, I imagine he said something like, haha, got you, although I'm sure that's not how it went down. But he did jump from the balcony onto the stage and made some comment about preserving the South, which I can't remember at the moment. He broke his leg in that fall, though, so his fleeing from the theater was hampered by the fact that he had broken his leg. He eventually was caught in a barn, and rather than being able to be arrested, the barn itself was burnt down. So John Wilkes Booth was killed. And Abraham Lincoln, obviously he's shot in the brain. I'm sorry, he doesn't survive. That's not what medicine is like. He does take about a day to die, but he does die in a hotel in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth, it becomes known, was part of a conspiracy theory. Not a conspiracy theory, a conspiracy plot. And this plot was meant to target a couple of key leaders in the Union. It was meant to target Lincoln, Seward, Johnson, Grant, a couple of key people. But actually, John Wilkes Booth didn't even necessarily know that the war was over. Like, it was so soon after surrender that Abraham Lincoln was shot that people hadn't even registered the end of the war. John Wilkes Booth may not have even known that the war was over. Some of the co-conspirators did not. None of the other conspirators were successful. This is a reenactment of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, and I just want to play it for you. This may get blocked out. If it gets blocked out, then it's going to cut it out now, and I'm very, very sorry, so the next part will be very weird, but let's try. Abraham Lincoln was not that attractive.
Again,
He also didn't give
I
a speech
say,
like this.
with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, we shall bind up the nation's wounds and cherish peace. That government of the people,
He did not give this
by
speech.
the people, for the people,
He did not give this speech at the theater, but he had given that speech earlier. They're just reenacting it because it's a good speech.
shall not perish from the earth. Thank you. God bless you all.
Mr. Lincoln, I'm just proud of you.
Also, Mary Todd Lincoln and Abraham Lincoln were not particularly close. Mary Todd had some severe mental issues after the death of their son.
Here, Peanuts. Hold the horse for me, will you?
Yes, sir. Will you be long, sir?
No, not very long.
Also, none of this is known. It's dramatic reenactment.
Would you mind bringing me a glass? I did it wrong.
I'm afraid you must be mistaken. Mr. Lincoln has just stopped the draft.
Suspense.
I would be too if it wasn't for that eternal servant critter with brass buttons on his coat.
They're mocking the South in the play. Okay, we're going to skip some of this here. Oh, look at the poor old man. Look at the scary bad guy with the eyeliner. Not suspicious at all. He broke his leg in that. Oh, right, that's what he said. Sic semper tyrannis. In other words, this is a tyrant. Right, that's what he wanted to say. And then he fled the theater. But in his jump, he was not super successful and got his leg tangled in one of those flags and broke his leg by the time that he landed. Okay, anyway, that was just for fun. You understand, this is not a video of the real thing. This is a reenactment. Okay. Okay, so John Wilkes Booth assassinates Lincoln 5 days after. And basically the nation is like, well, what the hell do we do now? And what they had to face was this world upturned, all of that to-do list of Abraham Lincoln. And it was an utter disaster. Lincoln died at a really critical moment, a moment of transition, a moment when the nation was mourning the Civil War. The death of Abraham Lincoln became a symbol for the mourning of the war. Now, the death of Abraham Lincoln is like macabre and fascinating. Macabre, there's your word for the day. It's phonetic for macabre. Look it up if you don't know it. Cool thing. Okay, so this is actually a map of Lincoln's funeral train. And the reason that this is the map is because it's meant to directly retrace. So when he went to Washington, when he was elected, oh, go back. I was just pointing at things. Oh, wait, I can point at things fancy. Laser pointer. Okay, in 1860, when he was elected, he went from Illinois to Washington on this kind of tour where he gave a bunch of speeches and talked to people. He went up through Pennsylvania, into New York, and then down to Washington, okay? After he died, in order to celebrate his life, they made him take the same route in the opposite way, except he was dead. Lincoln was one of the first people to be embalmed. Embalming technology was new at this time. Embalming, which is when you remove the fluid from a body and pump it full of chemicals so that it stays intact and does not rot as quick. So Abraham Lincoln gets embalmed. He gets put on this black funeral train draped in all sorts of Victorian garb. And the funeral train goes through from D.C. up through Pennsylvania. This is Philly here. Up into New York, down by the Finger Lakes, all through Ohio, and back into Illinois. And as it does this, it is greeted by every city. And there are huge trains of people. Not trains, literally, trains like marches, right? There are huge marches, huge celebrations of mourning, and people are dressed in black, and the cities get decked out in black, and people are really mourning him. In the North, of course. And Lincoln is also put on the train with his son Willie, who died of a fever at age 3, although someone is going to fact check me on that. And Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, never got over it, of course. And so he's put on there with the body of his dead son, and they are brought back to Illinois, and that becomes kind of this, like, thing of the nation. Now, this is a modern song that I would play for you, but I'm definitely going to get in trouble if I do. It's called The Funeral Train of Lincoln, and it's just a cool folk song. But it's modern. It has nothing to do with, it was not written in the past, although it's kind of about it. But interestingly, the North and the South saw this death differently. So obviously the North is mourning, right? We're talking about this process of national mourning. And many historians have said that it's not just mourning for Lincoln. It's mourning for everybody that died in the war. It's mourning for the war itself. It's like a way of national grief. But that's not happening in the South. In the South, they were like, yeah, we threw one last punch. Screw you guys. In the North, they're like, okay, but you threw that punch after the bell. Like, that was cheating. You just, what do you want to do? So the South is like, we were able to screw those powerful northern neighbors, and the North is like, you're playing dirty. These are both the way that they had seen each other before the war began. So Lincoln's death kind of reignites all of these things right after the war is over. It removes a competent leader from office right after the war is over, and it leads to a pretty disastrous consequence in another sense, which is this dude. Andrew Johnson, don't read those words yet. Don't focus on those. Obviously, when I cover them up on my screen, you don't see that. Andrew Johnson goes on my shit list. Andrew Johnson is one of the worst presidents that this country has ever seen. And the reason that he's one of the worst presidents this country has ever seen is because he simply did not agree with the ideals of Lincoln. He was an outlier. In 1864, so I want you to envision, did I get rid of this? No, whatever. It's 1864. In 1864, Abraham Lincoln was running for president. He was running for president, and the war was not necessarily going very well when he chose his running mate, the person that would run as vice president on the same ticket. Because the war was not going very well, he really wanted to appeal to people that didn't like war. He wanted to appeal to Northern Democrats, those people that were called Copperheads during the war. And because he wanted to appeal to them, he picked a dude as his running mate named Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a bet that the Republican Party lost. Let's pick Andrew Johnson, and we're screwed if he has to be president, but he's a conciliatory gesture towards Copperheads. But Andrew Johnson did have to be president, and he was a Southerner and was a Democrat. He was a slave owner, and he was a Southern sympathizer. He was a Democrat that supported war and had supported Lincoln because he thought that the South was far too powerful and he wanted to see the expansion of industry into the West. But Johnson himself, he was very hands-off federal government. He was very racist. He famously once said, "White men alone must rule the South." He was, in fact, a slave owner. When emancipation happened, he was like, Lincoln, look, my state didn't really do any of this stuff. We're kind of a border state. Can we just have an exemption here? Because, like, we're not the problem. And Lincoln was like, yeah, that makes sense. So he actually got an exemption for slaves and had slavery all the way up until a constitutional amendment did not allow it anymore. So Johnson does not like African American people. He thinks they very much so belong at a certain rung of society. He does not believe that the federal government should take a very strong approach. He was very much so a states' rights advocate. And that just simply, well, as you'll see, doesn't really work in a post-war period. And he didn't really like the rest of the Republican Party. He was not a Republican. He was a Democrat. And this is the guy that inherits that to-do list that Lincoln had. This would massively screw over the nation. In fact, like, if there is a hit list of people, I think about this often. I probably shouldn't think about this. This is also macabre. If there was a hit list of people and I got to go back in time and have a sniper, I wouldn't kill Andrew Johnson, but I would kill John Wilkes Booth. So there's like... Anyway, the consequences of him inheriting the presidency were utterly disastrous because he did not have the leadership, but he also didn't have the motivation to lead the nation through that post-war crisis. We can see that pretty much immediately after he takes presidency. So on May 29th of 1865, this is in the same month that, he's assassinated in April, the month after Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, Andrew Johnson is president, and he issues a proclamation of amnesty. This proclamation of amnesty, what if I don't want this anymore. God dang. I don't want that. Oh, good, okay. This proclamation of amnesty, which I've linked you into here, was in 1865. It's also this one. You can find it here through the Library of Congress, but I warn you, if you use this in your final paper, it needs to be contextualized because there are two amnesty proclamations, and many of you will just use it to say he offered amnesty, and that doesn't show me the difference, and it doesn't talk about it. So we can talk about that more if that's an issue for you. But in 1865, Andrew Johnson issued this amnesty proclamation, and it did say that not all people got to come back into the Union. But amnesty is this idea of forgiveness, right? And he basically said, most people who rebelled in the Confederacy, most people got to come back into the Union. And all they had to do was to take an oath of allegiance, hereby taking the oath herein prescribed. And that was this. I, blank, blank, do solemnly swear or affirm in the presence of the Almighty God that I will henceforth faithfully support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Union of the States thereunder. This is not a super, zoom in here a little bit more. This is not a super clear declaration. The southern states also said that they were defending the Constitution. But abide and faithfully support all laws and proclamations which have been made during the existing rebellion to the emancipation of slaves is a good thing. In other words, you have to obey the Emancipation Proclamation, and you have to say that you swear allegiance to the United States. But it's vaguely worded about defending the Constitution. But anyway, there were a couple of important exceptions. People who were diplomatic officers do not get, or foreign agents of the Confederate government do not get amnesty. People who left the United States to aid the rebellion do not get amnesty. Military or naval officers do not get amnesty. Now, a lot of these people had to specifically apply for amnesty, and they were granted amnesty. So the first amnesty proclamation in 1865, it had significant holes, not holes. It had significant allowance, it was significantly strong. It required certain things, but it also had a lot of holes. You could, what's to stop people from just being like, sure, yeah, sorry about that, cool. And they basically weren't held accountable in any way. All right, this would become important later, so keep that in the back of your head. Johnson also tried to cope with the issue of states. So all of these states had seceded from the Union, but they were still states, and they wanted to come back into the Union as states. In order to do that, Johnson said you have to have state constitutional conventions. You have to create new state constitutions, and then the federal government has to approve those constitutions, basically as if you were a territory and you're trying to come back in as a state because you've lost statehood. The problem is that he did not specify who votes in those states. So you could say, we're going to follow the laws that the state had, and under the laws that the state had, African American people don't get to vote. So therefore, we're going to recreate the government exactly as it was prior to the Civil War. Basically, Republicans start to say, okay, so Johnson, what you did was you allowed a lot of Confederates to come back into the Union. You granted pardons. This political cartoon here is of him granting pardons, right? You then allowed states to create constitutional conventions, but didn't change who was in leadership. And you had forgiven a lot of those prior politicians. So those states are looking exactly like they looked before. Is this everything? So if Johnson is just going to forgive everybody for everything, is this what the end of war is? Are we just going to pretend like that shit didn't happen? So Republicans, they fracture. And they had always been fractured in this way, but that fracture becomes deeper after Johnson's actions. Republicans are the party of Lincoln. They're the party that arose and therefore created the war. But they change. Moderate Republicans are like, we really need to try to protect black people in the South. We really need to try to reconcile with Southerners. Radical Republicans are growing increasingly strong, though. And they are saying, Johnson is shit. This is shit. These state constitutional conventions don't do anything. African Americans need full political participation. And Democrats are sort of out there supporting Johnson against both of those Republicans. And so you have people really raise the question, because of what Johnson is doing, are we just going to forget that shit happened? Because it kind of looks like everybody wants to forget that shit happened. One of the interesting ways that we can see this is because in the South, African Americans and supportive white people created alternate state conventions. Now, these conventions were political displays. So Again, ignore the text just for a second, then I will allow you to read it. But the Freedmen's Conventions are, freedmen is the term that we use to refer to people that were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, so ex-slaves, right? The Freedmen's Conventions asked African Americans to send delegates to a convention to create a new state constitution, and that would be a very radical new state constitution that would include rights for African American people that would actually change society after the war. Those constitutions would, of course, not be accepted by the federal government, and they knew that, right? But it was an action to show, look, there's a lot of support for a changing world down here, and your white-only conventions are not doing it, right? So a lot of people started pointing to black suffrage, that is, black people getting the vote, as the key thing that would actually start to make the difference. We are living in an important era in the history of the world. A large number of our citizens were, but a few months ago, held in bondage. Now that they are free men, they are entitled to all the rights of citizenship. But how to secure those rights is the important question. So it asks black people to start being more active. Now, we're going to talk more about the Freedmen's Conventions and black political participation in our class on Friday, because there's two sides to Reconstruction. I want you to understand that. There's the top-down Reconstruction, as in the federal government attempting to fix this shit, right? That's what we're talking about today. And then there's bottom-up Reconstruction, which is black people and white racists really fighting on the ground. And those two things are happening simultaneously. So just understand that that's going on, and we're going to get to some of that conversation on Friday. These Freedmen's Conventions also highlighted a bit of an inconsistency. There were Freedmen's Conventions throughout the South, but there were also some in the North. In states like Massachusetts, like a significant number of states in the North also did not allow black people to vote. In fact, after the Civil War was over, provisions got put on ballots to be voted in by state assemblies about whether or not they would allow black people to vote within the state. And a lot of states in the North did not pass those laws. They said, well, black people, like, they shouldn't be enslaved, but they shouldn't vote. So there's a significant problem here that's actually showing a broader political difference between the North and the South. So, meanwhile, people start to recognize the effects of Johnson's Reconstruction. So if you are looking at this and trying to look at this objectively, and you're like, okay, so here are the things that Lincoln had to do. How's Johnson doing? Are we going to evaluate Johnson a year into his presidency? Well, so let's take a look at some of the things that are happening. There is a significant amount of increased violence against ex-slaves in the South, from who here on out who I will call freed people. So people who had been enslaved, who were black in the South, are facing massive white violence, particularly the rise of the KKK. They're facing violence if they try to participate in politics. They're facing violence if they try to negotiate for good labor contracts. They face violence if they try to demand respect in any way, if they try to break segregation laws. So increased violence against freed people is a problem, obviously, for them, but it's also a problem nationally because people are going, well, what did we fight over? Is the war over? Why are they trying to reinstitute slavery in the South? There's also another problem. The rebirth of the Democratic Party. So basically, Johnson was like, okay, recreate your state governments, and I'm not going to tell you who can be in them, and I'm going to forgive a lot of officials. So because of that, because of the pardons to high-ranking officials and the pardons to high-ranking politicians, the Democratic Party reasserted itself in the South. There were a lot of people who were state senators prior to the secession of the South that became state senators again, right? Or wanted to under the state conventions. So, in other words, you have the same political parties being created, and you have the same violence against black people being created. And if you have those things, how are you going to avoid yet another war, right? In fact, many people in the South are saying, oh, well, we didn't need to win that war. We can still have what the South was, this ideology that is called the lost cause. Let's recreate what the South was. If we can't do it in fact of slavery, if we can't do it in the name of slavery, let's do it in fact. Let's do it in the real circumstances of black people and white people's lives. You also have the election of nine former Confederates to to the U.S. Congress, including the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. So, like, again, real political power to the people that had caused secession in the first place. And so this relates back to the KKK. This is so contradictory that it baffles me. So one of the things that the United States is very, very intent on keeping is state armies. And there's a lot of reasons for that, right? But it's in the Constitution that armies should get to raise militias, or states should have militias. And we take that very seriously, right? We want states to be able to defend themselves against the federal government if the federal government becomes tyrannical. But that was like kind of the whole thing of the Civil War, is that the South believed that that the federal government had become tyrannical, and they rebelled. Well, the way that they rebelled was by using their state militias to rebel. And after they try to come back into the Union, they are allowed to recreate those state militias. Well, guess what they recreate it from? The Confederate Army. So states are basically mustering an army, and that army says they will keep order in the South, and they start killing African Americans. So this is where you get the KKK. It comes directly from the Confederate Army and raised in local regiments in the South that start marauding and claiming that they are enacting their own kinds of justice and lynching a bunch of black people. So if you are looking at this and you're trying to figure out where to go from here, it basically looks like the war did nothing. Southerners are recreating slavery. It's not called slavery, but it is incredibly unfair economics. And again, we'll talk about that in our next class. They are recreating their own governments. They are the same exact people, and these tensions haven't gone anywhere. In fact, Johnson starts to get like real weird about this shit. He is forgiving everybody left and right, and everyone's like, you can't just forgive everybody after a rebellion. That doesn't work. And Andrew Johnson's like, well, I am just like Christ. I am the one forgiving everybody, and you won't allow me to forgive everybody. And that's basically like hating Jesus Christ. He says, if my blood is to be shed because I vindicate the Union and the preservation of its original purity and character, let it be shed. In other words, I will be a martyr for the South, and that makes me exactly like Jesus, and started using that language. And everyone was like, dude, no. Like, oh, I'm sorry, everybody in the North was like, dude, no. And the South was like, yeah, totes. That definitely makes sense. So Johnson does a lot of things that really anger Congress. He vetoes a lot of things. So this political cartoon right here, one of the powers that the presidency has is that they can veto bills that Congress passes. This was happening consistently in 1865 and 1866. The bill that causes the most discrepancy is over the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is a really important organization that we haven't talked about yet, but it was basically a governmental organization meant to help ex-slaves readjust to life after the war was over. It's a huge part of what the federal government did, and we will talk more about it on Friday. But that organization needed a crap ton of money because it was helping black people hold their previous owners accountable. It was helping them get literacy. It was helping them find family members. It was helping them get good labor contracts. And it needed a lot of money. Like, it needed a lot of support. And Johnson refused to give it money. In fact, he really wanted to gut the entire institution. So the thing that ends up causing some significant discrepancies between Congress and Johnson first is over this Freedmen's Bureau bill. So it's a bureau, ha ha ha, the Freedmen's Bureau, hence the cartoon. He's kicking a chest of drawers with black people in it, as in saying, like, the Freedmen's Bureau is trying to hold black people, and Johnson's just like, screw you guys. That's the political cartoon, because he uses the veto to do that. So Johnson's sympathy to the South, which seems to be just growing stronger and stronger and stronger over the course of his very short presidency, is starting to really piss off Congress. And it's starting to make these divides between the radical Republicans and the moderate Republicans a lot stronger, and it's making people shift themselves towards that radical Republican side, because they're saying, look, if we're not radical, like if we don't actually change the world after this war, Johnson's just going to recreate the circumstances that created war, and I don't understand how we're supposed to avoid slaughtering one another if that's the case. So more and more people shift over to that radical Republican side. And in 1866, those radical Republicans took the majority of congressional seats. That is important because after that election, they had a 2/3 majority. A 2/3 majority can negate the president's veto. This becomes important because Congress is over here trying to do shit, the president is over here trying to do shit, and they are just butting heads. You can see this in the Reconstruction Acts. So that radical Congress, after 1866, starts passing a bunch of laws. Those laws actually do shit in the South and make real significant changes. These are not passed by Johnson. These are passed by Congress. And every time that Congress passes one of these acts, Johnson is like, screw you guys, and he vetoes it. But they can pass it over his veto. So let's just go through a couple of these, what I mean by radical Reconstruction acts. In 1867, Congress divided the 10 unreconstructed states. So it said, here's all of the South. We're going to claim that these are military districts, roughly 2 states per district, and we're going to put governments in control of them that are martial. We're going to institute martial law in the South. Civil governments don't count. They are only provisional. They would clarify in July of 1867 that the military commanders had power over the civil government. In other words, they can take them out of office, right? They can suspend them. So the military is in control of that region. But there was another important thing, which is that those generals, those military generals, are required to register eligible voters, including black voters who are eligible because they're citizens, right? And we're going to talk about those constitutional amendments in a second. And they have to become part of those state constitutional conventions. In 1868, they clarified that every state has to draft a brand new constitution. That brand new constitution has to include cool things like the 13th and the 14th Amendment, which banned slavery and said that black people are citizens. And that has to be approved by Congress before martial law will go away and that state can come back into statehood. So in other words, it gave Congress the power to decide when a state had actually gotten their shit together and made a constitution that was accurate. It said that the martial law had to actually register black voters, and it said that civil authority didn't mean anything until those new constitutions took effect. This is basically saying the military is going to fix this because you're not doing it on your own. And Johnson said, no, you can't do that. You're reinstigating war. And Congress is like, if we don't do this, you are recreating the circumstances under which war happened. So Congress and the president are on completely separate pages about how to make the nation a sustainable one after the war is over. Johnson is trying to recreate the pre-war world. Congress is saying the pre-war world led to war. You can't do that. And Johnson is saying, well, what you're doing is angering the South enough to provoke them to war. So you've got a significant amount of difference. Basically, at the root of it is that Johnson does not believe that the South should be obligated to bring black people into the nation. And the Radical Congress does. It says if we're going to have any change at all, it's going to involve really working with black citizens to get them to be part of the nation. And they decide that they're going to launch Reconstruction with or without Johnson. And this hadn't happened before because you hadn't had Congress and the president diametrically opposed. They weren't collaborating, right? They were just outvoting one another. A couple of things happen in 1868 that really end up making them on opposite pages. These tensions between Congress and Johnson are escalating. Basically, Johnson's like, okay, what in the Constitution can I do to take away Congress's power? And he does everything he can possibly do. One of the things that he does is he passes another amnesty proclamation, and that amnesty proclamation in 1868 forgave all Confederates. It forgave Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Like it basically said, here, we're not going to say basically said, we're going to just say what it said. Amending this one, amending this proclamation. Achoo, sorry. Achoo. Hereby proclaim and declare unconditionally and without reservation to all and every person who directly or indirectly participated in the late insurrection or rebellion a full pardon and amnesty for the offense of treason against the United States or of adhering to their enemies during the late Civil War, with the restoration of all rights, privileges, and immunities under the Constitution and the laws which have been made in pursuance thereof. This is important for a couple of reasons. It's important because of if you give them amnesty, they can participate in civil government, right? But also if you give them amnesty, they get their property back. And that ended up being an issue as well for Black people. So we're going to talk about that in the next lecture, but keep that in mind. This amnesty proclamation gave Confederates back all Confederates, like even the president of the goddamn Confederacy, gave them back their citizenship, gave them back their right to run for office, gave them back their property, gave them back pretty much everything that they had lost during the war, with the exception of slaves. Really? Sorry, everybody. Okay, so that was important. He also made a couple of appointments to those military commanders. So if military commanders were the ones that made all of these decisions, think about this, right? Military commanders get to be in charge of these districts, not civil commanders. Johnson's like, hey, but I am the commander-in-chief, and I can appoint the military. So he starts fighting with Congress by the appointments that he makes. And he appoints very, very pro-Southern military leaders to supervise those districts. And they do not do what they're supposed to do and register Black people. And then he does something that is something Congress doesn't like, but it is also, more importantly, a technicality. Johnson violated something called the Tenure of Office Act. Now, the Radical Congress had created the Tenure of Office Act. They passed the Tenure of Office Act over Johnson's veto. And what it said was, you're not allowed to fire people that the previous president had hired to be members of the cabinet unless you approve it through Congress. They did this deliberately to limit Johnson's power. That act, by the way, is no longer in existence. And he basically just violated it because he didn't believe in it. And he fired Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War under Lincoln, and he hired someone else. He tried to hire Grant. Grant was like, I'm not getting in the middle of that. And then he hired some guy named Thomas. And that guy, last name Thomas, he was, it was a violation of the Office of Tenure Act. And when he did this, Congress was like, that's the thing. Everything else you did was an asshole thing to do, but it was totally legal. That was illegal. We caught you. So Johnson is impeached. He becomes the first president to be impeached when the House votes for impeachment in February of 1868. Just a quick clarification. He is the first of 4 presidents to be impeached. Technically, what the word impeachment means is that the House decides that there is enough evidence to send the president to trial under certain things that have been violated. So if they say the president has violated the Office of Tenure Act, they get to send him to a trial, and that trial happens in the Senate. So impeachment technically means the House passes these laws. Now, Trump passes these resolutions. Trump was impeached, but he was not removed from office because he was not found guilty. Clinton was impeached, but he was not removed from office because he was not found guilty. Nixon was also impeached, but rather than be tried, he resigned. So no president has actually been impeached and then been found guilty, but there have been 4 presidents that have been impeached. Now, again, the process of impeachment is that the House of Representatives goes, okay, we declare that the president has violated this, this, and this, and then they vote on those resolutions and they pass them. That sends the impeachment to the Senate, where the Senate becomes a trial because it's trying to regulate a balance of powers, right? It's the only instance in which the Senate is a jury rather than actually having the Supreme Court do that. That Senate needs to decide whether or not the president is guilty, but a 2/3 majority vote are required to find the president guilty. Johnson barely squeaks by. So I want to emphasize the reading that I gave you today, which was this. Now, people are going to get confused about this, and you're going to try to count it as a primary source, and you may or may not do it correctly. But the basic gist of it is that all of this stuff is a secondary source, because this is the Senate. This is the United States Senate, right? This is their account of what happened. But the articles themselves are a primary source. So this is when, this is exactly what Congress declared. This is what the House declared. That he did these things, issued an order in writing for the removal of Edwin Stanton. He should not have done these things. There were a couple of articles of impeachment. That was one. The other is basically that he was just a bad person. And so there was a couple more. This is the primary source of that. But these parts are secondary sources, because this is a United States Senate historian talking about what the case was and why Johnson was eventually impeached. So just keep that in mind as you are writing your papers if you choose to use this. Now, one of the things that was important about Johnson's impeachment is that pretty much all people agreed that he violated the Tenure of Office Act. That was not in question. What was in question, or at least what became in question, and maybe shouldn't have been for the Senate, was the Office of Tenure Act something that was good, and should Johnson be removed? In fact, one of the things that we know is that vote that determined that he was not guilty, that one vote was by a guy that did not want to establish the precedent of impeachment. So basically, Johnson was as guilty as you could possibly be. But people were really, really reluctant to see impeachment work. And because of that, he just didn't get removed from office. He finished out his presidency, but it was an election year, and Johnson didn't have any support. So the Democrats ran this dude named Horatio Seymour. There's a little pun here. We shall see more rads bottled up in November. We shall see more radical Republicans stopped, right? And then the radical Republicans ran Ulysses S. Grant. Basically, so this is Ulysses S. Grant here. And this is the ship that is the United States being navigated by this that says war and peace. In other words, Ulysses S. Grant was the guy that won the war. He is the one that can navigate us through peace. He's the one that will be able to make this happen. This is supposed to be Seymour. He knows nothing about steering. What I know about steering, down with Grant. And so yeah, political cartoons are really fun. But basically, radical Republicans were like, this is who we need. We need Ulysses S. Grant because he's the only one that can actually manage a nation in crisis. He did it during the war. He's going to bring us to peace, even if that peace has to be a forced peace. And the Democrats had lost all credibility because of Johnson. So in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant wins the election. And Ulysses S. Grant resides over some of the most radical, awesome years in United States history. He's also terribly corrupt, but we'll get to that problem later. Okay, so I want to go to this slide because I want to sort of remind you of what was happening. Above this line is pre-Grant. The 15th Amendment actually takes place after Grant. But we hadn't talked about this. So Grant is important because he finishes this triumvirate of what we call the Radical Reconstruction Amendments. The first is the 13th Amendment. This had been passed by Abraham Lincoln in January of 1865 that mandated the abolition of slavery. It was better than the Emancipation Proclamation because it said no slavery anywhere, ever, done. 14th Amendment ensured citizenship rights, which, if you remember, had been taken away by the Dred Scott decision. This was passed over Johnson's veto in the in-between period between the impeachment and Johnson leaving office. And then you have the 15th Amendment. This would be passed after Grant's administration. So in the South, states had to include black voters, but many of them still weren't. And the northern states did not include black voters. So a federal law was necessary in order to make sure that black people could vote. And it ended up being Ulysses S. Grant that presided over that. Now, there are some things that I want to say about the 15th Amendment. This is technically the 15th Amendment. The right of citizens of the United States, vote, shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So think about that just for a second. People had been arguing about a bill like this for a really long time. But it's a huge question. Should the federal government get to determine who votes? Or should that be a state issue? Basically, the federal government was like, states lost that right. They need to rely on the federal government to tell them who should vote. But there were a lot of cool things when people were debating the ratification of this that would have been even more radical. People talked about banning poll taxes. They talked about making sure that states create literacy so that citizens can vote. They talked about making the vote accessible. They even talked about giving the vote to women. None of those things ended up in the final bill because in order to get something passed, people had to compromise. Which means that the 15th Amendment had a lot of loopholes. So the law does not include anybody else. This law says race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It does not say class. It does not say education level. It does not say gender. It does not say anything else. So there are a lot of loopholes because of who it does and does not include. The law also does not specify what it means to give somebody the vote, and it leaves open the possibility that states would do a lot of things to prevent people from voting, and they very much so did. So states would implement literacy tests that were impossible to pass. They would require that people pay poll taxes, and African Americans did not have the money to do that. They would institute grandfather clauses that said, well, you can't vote if your grandfather was a slave, which is technically not a violation of this 15th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment was not foolproof. In fact, it left a lot of holes open. And states walked right through those holes. We're going to talk about that when we talk about more ground-up politics. But again, remember, top-down, ground-up. But basically, states took that and ran with it because there were holes in it. Those holes would not be closed until 1964. The Civil Rights Act and then later the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and respectively 1965. These issues would not be solved until then. That's a century away and required a massive civil rights movement in order to do that. In July of 1870, Georgia finally ratifies its constitution and it re-enters the Union. Technically, this is when we say that presidential and congressional Reconstruction is at an end, because that's the last state. Of course, this isn't how the story actually ends. We're going to talk more about that when we discuss ground-up politics. Overall, there are some serious successes that come with political Reconstruction. This is Grant, by the way, one of the best beards in U.S. history. Political Reconstruction is important because we see occupation and the return to statehood, right? Awesome. The military stays until the states come back into the Union. We see constitutional amendments that actually guarantee the rights of black people. And we see the rise of radical republicanism. We see the rise of a black party in the South. Republicans in the North were what they are, and we've talked about them, but we also see an indigenous political party in the South that is Southern radical republicanism. And they vote like actual people into office. From 1868 to 1876, there were 14 black congressmen, 2 black senators. And in state elections, the percentages were even better. So we would not see those gains again because black voting in the North, although it was legal, they didn't have the same numbers. So in the South, we would actually see significant amounts of black voting, and we would see significant amounts of black politicians, and they would be a critical part of the party. But there were also major failures. Constitutional loopholes left open things for states to do to disenfranchise black people, and they very much so did. It also left open the rise of the KKK. This would try Grant would try really hard to prevent the KKK, and we'll see those in the enforcement acts that he passed, but he wouldn't be that successful. So we see the rise of this like lost cause ideology, which is a very violent ideology that tries to bring the South back into power. We'll talk more about that. And those occupying forces whipped the South back into shape, but they didn't actually solve economic crises that ended up shaping the South for a few generations. So they didn't manage to find any real economic solution to the problems of the South, which was not like, oh, let's feel bad for ex-slave owners, they're really poor, but it was actually like, okay, there's massive class differences between white people and black people, and they didn't work those out. They left them standing. So there are massive failures as well, things that the government could have done better. But what we see is this moment that we would not see again when the federal government was deeply committed to actually envisioning and implementing racial equality, which was crazy. Like, what would it actually look like if the federal government wanted to see a profoundly altered world? We start to get a glimpse of that, but it ultimately is not as powerful as it otherwise could have been. That war, although it was waged at the federal level, was also waged at the local level. So in our next lecture, we're going to talk about how people that don't go down famously in history, like Ulysses S. Grant and Andrew Johnson, are dealing with a post-war world on the ground after the war. That's what I've got for you guys today. Have an awesome day. Stay safe, stay sane, and I will see you later.